Selain terkenal sebagai pemimpin yang merakyat, Gubernur DKI Jakarta Joko Widodo juga terkenal dengan gayanya yang khas saat berpidato atau berbicara di depan umum. Tidak jarang Jokowi menyelipkan sejumlah lelucon di tengah pemaparannya terkait program kerja pemerintah daerah.
Bodi saya kayak gini, saya ini kan kurus kering. Berat badan saya hanya 54 kilo. Ajudan saya tinggi besar, ganteng. Ternyata ada problem. Setiap tamu yang datang ke kantor saya, yang disalami selalu ajudan saya. Satu bulan saya masih kuat, 1 bulan saya masih kuat. 2 bulan saya mulai nggak kuat. 3 bulan saya betul-betul nggak kuat dan muncul kekreatifan saya. Saya mulai kreatif saat itu, langsung sudah. Ajudan saya ganti dengan ajudan yang lebih jelek dari saya.
Beginilah gaya khas Jokowi saat berbicara di depan umum. Tidak jarang Jokowi bergaya ala stand-up komedi walau ia sedang memaparkan berbagai program penting yang akan dijalankan pemerintah Provinsi DKI Jakarta. Contohnya saat Jokowi menjadi pembicara di seminar ekonomi kreatif bersama Menteri Pariwisata Mari Eka Pangestu, dosen dari Universitas Adelaide Jerman, dan dipandu oleh Jaya Suprana. Jaya Suprana yang terkenal dengan celotehan yang lucu tapi tajam, ternyata tidak membuat Jokowi mudah tersinggung. Gubernur DKI Jakarta ini justru meladeninya.
Itu lebih lagi. Saya kalau masuk ke kampung-kampung itu anak-anak umur 5 tahun 10 tahun manggilnya nggak pakai Pak, nggak pakai Mas. Jokowi datang.
Masih lumayan Bang tuh. Wih.
Bahkan sampai akhir acara, Jokowi yang menjadi pusat perhatian di seminar tersebut masih terus meladeni setiap guyonan yang ia terima. Salah satunya saat ia mendapat hadiah sarung dari panitia acara. Selain memberi pencerahan tentang ekonomi kreatif, Jokowi juga memberi angin segar tersendiri bagi seminar yang biasanya berlangsung monoton. Dari Jakarta, Jenis Mangunsong, Arif.
Ya nggak tahu, tanya yang mau tanya saya. Sebentar, itu anunya.
Hello, I'm Liam Gammon and this is New Mandala TV. I'm a PhD candidate at the Department of Political and Social Change at the ANU's College of Asia and Pacific. I'm joined here today by Greg Feely, who researches Islamic politics and religious life in Indonesia. I'm with Arianto Patunru, who is an economist at the ANU's Indonesia project, and a fellow political and social change PhD candidate, Eve Warburton, who studies the politics of resource nationalism in Indonesia. Now, as we're recording this video, President Joko Widodo, or Jokowi, as we'll henceforth refer to him, is in Washington, D.C., and he's about to have a dinner in his honor with John Kerry. He's about to meet Barack Obama in the Oval Office and be feted by US business leaders and, most importantly, have dinner with the CEO of Apple. Now, just a few years ago, if I'd have said the mayor of Solo would be meeting with Barack Obama in the Oval Office, people would have looked at you as if you were a bit crazy. So, nevertheless, it's happened. So, in a sense, it's only been quite recently that we've really got a feeling for the kind of man that Jokowi is and the kind of political leader that he is. So, I just want to open up this chat today by asking, what do you think is the most interesting or surprising thing that we've learned about Jokowi, the man, his character, in his first 12 months? Something that that wasn't revealed to us, wasn't apparent before he became president.
Well, if I start, it has been a meteoric rise, but in some ways, at least from where I stand, Jokowi has become a more enigmatic figure the higher he has risen. And when we hear some of the stories from the palace, reported in the media and elsewhere, about how his personal behaviour is changing, how he's becoming more formal and the like, he is clearly a politician in the process of development. I think one of the things that surprised about the last year has been the lack of political fortitude that he's shown, particularly in facing down other powerful forces in his coalition. His willingness to compromise on matters that we previously thought were very dear to him, such as having reform-minded, economically rational people in the cabinet, people with strong track records. Most of those things were unexpected. And I, for one, am still not sure what the prospects are for JOKOWI to improve his presidential performance in the remaining 4 years, because in some ways he's slightly improved his position. In other ways, I think we seem to have a fairly fixed pattern of him not paying attention to a whole lot of reform issues, focusing on economic issues, but most importantly of all, not doing anything to cause ructions within his cabinet. And that means that he has become a politician much like many of the people whom he's replaced.
Essentially, it's business as usual. Is that the feeling for what the next 4 years heralds?
Largely it's that. There are some distinctive things about JOKOWI, the people he has around him. In some ways, the people whom he trusts most, in some ways, are a different kind of person to the kind of people that SBY or Megawati would have had around them. But nonetheless, I think he's still far too concerned about political stability, and he has no sense of brinksmanship about him. And really, for him to have broken through those conventional boundaries of Indonesian politics to really put a distinctive stamp on his presidency, he needed to have an element of that taking on his enemies. And that would have seen, I think, an entirely different dynamic in politics now in Indonesia. But I suspect a great many of the coalition partners feel that they have his measure, and they know if they put pressure on him that he will yield.
The economy and the president's outlook on the economy is one of those areas where the evidence is so confounding and confusing. So I want to ask you, Pak Arianto, for the first, I suppose, 9 or 10 months or so of the administration, they came in for some very, very heavy criticism about interventionist and protectionist policies on trade, restricting the ability of expatriates to work in Indonesia, making price controls and so on and so forth. Right. Yet in the last few months, we've got a real kind of change in tone in some areas. The appointment of Thomas Lembong, a real man of a real liberal persuasion as trade minister, a change in rhetoric from the palace, which focuses upon improving the business climate. And for the last few fortnights, we've seen this drip feed of announcements of cutting red tape in areas like taxation and business licensing and so on. So do you think that this change in tone is really anything substantial, or is it really a matter of branding?
Well, first of all, the reshuffle was just over 2 months ago, right? So it's probably too early to judge the performance of the new ministers. But if the remarks by, for example, Minister Thomas Lembong after his inauguration is of any indication, I think we have hope. And for example, he said that we have to undo these protectionist measures because such measures actually backfires in the end. So I think that's a good sign. And these packages, as you know, the government has just launched 5 packages. Looking at the content, I think there are hopes, especially on the trade front. For example, there is a clause to not require recommendation from Ministry of Agriculture and Industry anymore for import of, say, sugar, and not requiring a double check or survey from Surveyor Indonesia for something that is already checked in the customs. So this, I think, is a good sign. But again, it's just 2 months. We never know that. I hope they will walk the talk, right? So, and also now that the government, President JOKOWI himself is now in US to persuade investors, if you like. I think it's a good sign. I mean, in the first year, people have been saying that actually Jokowi might not be very interested in international, communities, but, unlike SBY, for example. But now he's trying to, at least we see the sign that he's trying to be pragmatic and to be more investor friendly, if you like. So, yeah, there is hope.
Yeah. I'd like to just ask one issue that has really come to the fore during the first year of Jokowi's presidency is trade in agricultural commodities,
right,
and the idea of self-sufficiency or independence in food,
right,
that has become a real kind of touchstone for a lot of nationalist politicians in Indonesia. Jokowi himself has seemed keen on this, so isn't it a bit of a contradiction to have this stated goal of food self-sufficiency, yet at the same time promising liberalisation in trade?
Yeah, contradiction is a good way to put it, I think. So he has ministers, but not all of them see eye to eye. So I don't think, well, I think Thomas Lembong, I hope he will become a better trade minister, but there is this Minister of Agriculture who keeps pushing on self-sufficiency, and I think it's not the right time, it's not the right policy at the moment, especially, for example, sufficiency in all these commodities, rice, sugar, soybean and others. And the fact that El Nino is coming, it's going to make it far worse, and saying that the stocks are enough, and we just know it's not enough because the price keeps increasing, and if the price of this basic commodity increase, it actually hurts the poor. So I'm hoping that Pak Darmin, for example, the coordinating minister, can actually sort of navigate these different views in the cabinet towards a better outcome.
Yeah. Just more broadly, do we think, or do we have any idea if Jokowi himself has any kind of solid convictions on economic matters, or is he simply going on the advice of people around him?
That's a difficult question, but I think well, first of all, he's a pragmatic, and I think at the end of the day, he will see that the stock is not there, and for example, fiscal space is also not enough. So, like the events in the last few days, we can see that he actually understands what was the problem, and what the problems are. And I think, well, he seems like a very good leader, but unfortunately, he probably lacks of macro narrative, if you like. So it probably takes some time, but the recent indications, I think, give us some hope that he is actually learning that things are not as good as he is being told by his, for example, Minister of Agriculture.
Eve, you've been doing research on the political economy of the resources sector in Indonesia, which is quite a mess of political economy, if there ever was one. So Jokowi did actually come to office with sort of a personal interest in reforming the mining sector and cleaning up some of the vested interests and rent-seeking that occurs in that industry. So what went wrong? Because it doesn't seem to have sort of taken place.
Yes, that's right. If we cast our minds back to the presidential campaign, Jokowi did indeed sort of sell this narrative that he was going to rid the sector, this very strategic sector of energy and mining, of vested interests. And in Indonesia, the term is the mafia. And indeed, I think in the first few months, there were really positive signs that he was committed to reform in this sector. And the first sign of progress was the appointment of Sudirman Said to the Minister for Energy and Mineral Resources. And prior to Jokowi, under SBY, we had political appointees. We had appointments of people who were widely seen as kind of political operators and corrupt indeed. And so with the appointment of Sudirman Said, we, for the first time in a long time, had widely regarded as a clean minister, a pragmatic minister, lots of experience in the bureaucracy. So that was a really good sign. He also went ahead and appointed an independent team to provide recommendations to him on how to clean up the oil and gas sector, which is notoriously corrupt, in particular the importing of oil into Indonesia. So those were really good signs. But then I think, and we see this not just in this sector, but this contradiction and and chaos, in fact, and erratic behaviour in the way Jokowi approaches policy and approaches reform. So on the one hand, he was pointing to progress, to reform, and on the other hand, at the same time, we see many cases where Jokowi has bent to the pressure of vested business interests, particularly within his own coalition. And so just to point to one case study in particular, right at the same time as he appointed this independent team to look into corruption in oil and gas imports, he then gave the green light to Surya Paloh, the head of the National Democratic Party, one of his coalition partners, to go ahead and facilitate an importing deal with Angola through one of Surya Paloh's own private business partners from China. It was incredibly dubious, terrible optics, but again, this is this contradiction that Jokowi, that we can't. He's unpredictable in the way he approaches these reforms, and I think it speaks to perhaps his own lack of understanding and naivety of the way that the rent seeking works in the sector. But I think also it reflects a kind of superficial commitment to transparency. And there are many other cases we could, of course, point to as well.
I mean, in a broader sense, and we look at some of the way he makes decisions that affects the interests of people around him, is he well aware that he's being put under pressure by rent seekers and vested interests? Or is it a question of he doesn't know a dodgy confidant when he sees one? What's our feeling on that?
I think with the particular case that I just mentioned, I think that, and we know this from other cases as well, sometimes Jokowi signs things that he doesn't read. Sometimes he doesn't do his research. I think it did in that case demonstrate perhaps there was a political deal made in advance. Perhaps he just really didn't understand the nature of the deal and didn't know who this Chinese investor was or this broker was. But I think in other cases, and again I would refer to the mining sector, Jokowi is aware that he is constantly managing the vested business interests of the elites around him. I mean, it's public knowledge that the Vice President Yusuf Kalla has interest in the mining sector, of course Surya Paloh, and then indeed Luhut Panjaitan, his former Chief of Staff and now one of the coordinating ministers, has direct interests in the sector. And Jokowi is constantly trying to balance these interests, but he does a very poor job of it, and it has an effect on the direction of policy and on some of the government's decisions on key strategic contracts with big foreign oil and gas and mining companies. And I think that to a large extent what we had hoped is that Jokowi would attempt to insulate his minister from these vested business and vested political interests. And instead he's hot and cold with his minister and often abandons him. And I think that that speaks to, I think, perhaps also what Greg mentioned in terms of his own personal character as well.
May I just add to that, Liam, that sometimes I think in the foreign media an impression is given that Jokowi is something of a very pure politician and something of an ingenue. And I think one of the mysteries with him is that on the one hand he does look as if he's out of his depth politically, and we've got the case that Eve mentioned about Surya Paloh and Sampo, but in other cases we know from his time as Governor of Jakarta and Mayor of Solo that he was quite prepared to do political deals, and what's more, he was quite prepared to use sensitive information that came into his possession as leverage against parties in the local parliaments to make sure that they passed things that he wanted to get through. So this was very much a practical politician at work, and that for me is one of the mysteries about Jokowi, working out at what point we suddenly get Jokowi the operator, prepared to do things that are a little bit questionable to achieve an end, and at what point we suddenly get Jokowi is the person who is compliant. And that's one of the things that I think we're all trying to work out about Jokowi at the moment.
I mean, after having piled onto him collectively over the past year, I mean, can we see anything that's worth defending in this administration? Are there any areas where he has actually used the political tools that are available to him to sort of pursue something that he really cares about?
Well, from economic front, I think one of the policies that has been applauded is the removal of the fuel subsidy. just in the, 4-5 months he was in the office, and I think that's a very good policy. It was unpopular, but he did it, and of course we now want to see the effect. The saved money is now, according to the government, is given to infrastructure, which is, of course, is very needed for development at the moment. But in the future, we also want to see, reallocation for education and health, for example. So, yeah, that's one of the policies that I think he uses common sense and good politics.
Now, of course, you can't talk about Jokowi's infrastructure drive without talking about the role of China in Indonesia's foreign relations and increasingly the economy. Is there a feeling that Jokowi and the government understand the geopolitical consequences of, in some ways, quite publicly aligning themselves with Chinese economic power? Anybody?
I'm not sure whether Jokowi understands the geopolitics of cozying up to China. I think that, yes, we have seen Jokowi open the doors to Chinese investment. Certainly in the minerals and energy sector, they need investment. There's been a big push to develop the downstream industrialization of the resource sectors, and China has been a huge player in that, and they need that sort of investment. We've also seen a recent decision to choose a Chinese investor over a Japanese investor for a big rail infrastructure project in Indonesia. So we can see that the government is obviously prioritizing and is interested in Chinese investment. But then publicly, the media has been quite critical of some of these decisions, and we are beginning to see a bit of public debate about whether Indonesia should be cozying up in this way to China. But I don't know. I'm not sure I can speak to whether Jokowi himself or those in his executive are thinking in terms of the geopolitics of this. I don't know if Greg wants to comment on that.
One thing I'd say is that the Chinese have been very effective in cultivating Jokowi. President Xi went to Indonesia and spent 3 days there, which is a long time for the Chinese president to be there, in April when Indonesia was marking the 60th anniversary of the Asia-Africa summit. And so the Chinese have been investing a great deal of time in persuading Indonesian leaders of the merits of their various projects that they're putting forward. To my mind, this is one of the questions one has to ask about Jokowi. We'd previously thought that he was very development-minded and could be quite technocratic and rational. But in the case of the fast train project between Jakarta and Bandung that he was referring to, this is a classic case in point. The Japanese got the contract to build the subway, the MRT, in Jakarta, or they're the main contractor. And there's a sense in Indonesia that these deals have to be shared around. But if you look at Japan's record in building high-speed railways and China's record, you would say there's really no argument. The Japanese have got a superb record of reliable investment in Indonesia, high engineering standards, everything they build works well. The Chinese have got a very checkered history in Indonesia. The power stations they built often never get more than 30 or 40% of their design capacity and the like, because there are all sorts of problems with them. So by rights, if the government was doing this on the basis of merit, that project should have gone to the Japanese. And I think we've seen anger on the part of the Japanese government, which is unprecedented towards Indonesia, and indeed towards any other country, I think, for a long, long time, because they felt as if their claim was so much stronger than the Chinese. So clearly, Jokowi felt as if on this matter, some special treatment towards, some privileged treatment towards the Chinese would be a good thing. I think it's going to turn out to be a bad thing for Indonesia, I must say.
I agree that this railway incident has hurt reputation of Indonesian international forum, and so I'm hoping that Jokowi can, learn from it, and especially now that there is this new thing, TPP, which China is not part of. But also, on the other hand, there is RCEP, Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership Agreement, which China is a part of. So Indonesia should really be careful in dealing with this, and because at the same time Indonesia is also preparing itself for the AEC, ASEAN Economic Community. So all these things has to be in the eye of Jokowi also.
Perhaps I should have mentioned that before. I mean, Luhut Panjaitan, this very important minister, and Jokowi himself have not ruled out. In fact, they've made almost teasing comments about the possibility of Indonesia's joining the TPP. Do you think that's a realistic scenario?
It is probably, but in terms of time, Indonesia has been investing on AEC and RCEP, so I think in terms of priority, they should really focus on these two former negotiations, which is actually both of them are ending this the negotiation this year, right? So TPP is next in the agenda because Indonesia is not part of the TPP, but for ASEAN and RCEP, of course, Indonesia is there, and RCEP is basically ASEAN plus 6, right? So China, Korea, India, Australia, also New Zealand are part of this, and I think Indonesia should pay attention more towards what is going on in the region. But at the same time, of course, TPP is also important because it covers a lot of economy in the world, and the idea of both TPP and RCEP actually to streamline all these conflicting rules as a result of FTS, bilateral FTS, which is making some kind of spaghetti ball effect. So it's a good thing if Indonesia can maybe lead in ASEAN for these two initiatives, ASEAN and RCEP.
I think it's fair to say that in Jokowi we see a president that is perhaps far less concerned with his own image overseas, and perhaps even with Indonesia's image overseas, compared to President Yudhoyono. I mean, Australians will be familiar with the execution of 2 of our nationals in February this year, the current haze crisis that's engulfing Southeast Asia, and of course, like you said, some of these issues to do with investment climate and perceived openness to foreign investment. How much do you think of this so-called resurgence in nationalism that we're hearing about, particularly in the foreign media, can be sheeted home to Jokowi, his own example, or perhaps a lack of leadership on his part? Or how much of this was just going to happen anyway?
I think that's an interesting question, because if we look at some of the sort of policy manifestations of this kind of increased assertiveness in the nationalist tone of politics in Indonesia, some of the more nationalist policies and nationalist rhetoric that we observe in the mineral mining sector were very much part of SBY's administration and his last term. So to an extent, you know, in my own research, I've been seeing this trend toward more assertive nationalism for some time. But I think that we can see the presidential elections as almost a turning point in the kind of mainstreaming of this more aggressive nationalism. And we can point partly to the kind of campaign that Prabowo launched. It was very aggressive, and it kind of painted this picture of Indonesia as a country that was regularly exploited and shamed by its neighbours and by foreign investors. And I think that perhaps many political elites saw that as resonating with the Indonesian publics, and perhaps that could explain to an extent why Jokowi has picked up on that and used that in ways that we hadn't expected, and why particular ministers have picked up on that and used that in ways that we wouldn't have expected. But I don't know, perhaps Greg wants to comment, or Archie.
Yeah, I think it's true about Jokowi. I think the world outside Indonesia for Jokowi is of interest to him insofar as Indonesia can learn from other countries and also make money out of them by exporting Indonesian products or bringing in the kind of investment that allows him to achieve these very ambitious goals that he's set for his infrastructure program, also to a lesser extent for health and education. And you mentioned the executions, Liam. I think that's a very good example where one of the things that was said to him by a senior advisor was, if the economy was growing at 7%, President, well then perhaps it wouldn't matter if you're executing all these people from foreign countries. But when the economy is actually doing poorly and is growing below, 5%, well then actually you cannot afford to be alienating all these foreign countries. And that was packaged in a way that that person thought Jokowi would understand. The moment it hit Indonesia's ability to get what it wanted from the world outside, well then that became a concern to him. And I think he's actually an extraordinarily insular president in that regard, with a very instrumental view of how he sees foreign relations anyway. And the narrowest agenda that we've seen of any president, I think, in Indonesian history. And so we also see the markedly different messages he has for an international audience, where he's trying to get investment and promote exports, and the very nationalistic rhetoric he has when he's dealing with Indonesian audiences. We from outside see a clear contradiction in this. It's another one of the mysteries for Jokowi, whether that is a contradiction in his own mind or all of these things can be rationalised. But I think it's going to be a problem for him because more and more people will see him as being inconsistent.
Now, of course, one of the things that was a real stain on the legacy of the Widodo government was the deterioration in the rights and security of religious minorities in Indonesia. Now, Jokowi came to office known for being not particularly orthodox Muslim, and his party that nominated him sees itself as the vanguard sort of Indonesian pluralism. So has that made a difference, or are we still seeing that continued decline in religious pluralism in Indonesia?
If we look at, it's a mixed picture. If we look at the statistics from the NGOs that collect data on religious conflict, religious violence and harassment, the figures are better for the last year or so than what they've been through the final years of the SBY period. However, Jokowi himself can take, I think, very little credit for that. He has a religious affairs minister, Lukman Hakim Saifuddin, who has been the most progressive of any religious affairs minister going back probably at least 12 years. And he's not unalloyed in his promotion of religious tolerance. He also picks his battles and at times makes strategic retreats, but overall I think most people accept that he is trying to make Indonesia a more religiously tolerant place. In the case of Jokowi, there are almost no statements on the public record about religious tolerance. We do have responses to particular incidents of violence, such as the Tolikara case in Papua, and in fact state officials responded very well to that, and they were able to prevent that from spreading much more widely. We've had a somewhat similar response to the church burning in Aceh, but overall the disappointment with Jokowi is that he hasn't set a tone of tolerance himself. And we can look at this not just in religious field but more broadly in political sphere. So in the last few weeks we've had controversies over such things as the ability of the Shiite community in Indonesia to celebrate the Ashura festival, one of the main festivals on the religious calendar of Shia Muslims. There's been no statement from the government about that, which is very disappointing. Also, we see the closing down of the public discourse, the public discussion about the mass killings in 1965. And both of these things are surprising because Jokowi's main political affiliation is with Megawati's PDIP, the Indonesian Democratic Party of Struggle. And that party has within its parliamentary representation a prominent Shia intellectual, and it also has several people who come from former communist families, families of victims of these killings. And so PDIP of all parties has a track record of defending not only secular rights but also an open historical judgment of these critical events in Indonesian history. What we see under Jokowi is a narrowing, a closing down of a lot of that debate, and that for me was entirely unexpected, and that shows that Jokowi to some extent is captive of very conservative elements in the military, and he's not giving any pushback to these very regressive moves that those people are seeking to undertake.
On the other side of the ledger, though, to an extent, Jokowi has a better sort of relationship or rapport with progressive elements of Indonesian civil society and the Indonesian political system. His new chief of staff is one of the founders of a key anti-corruption NGO. He has the ability to communicate with sort of liberals in civil society and so on. Is there any kind of pattern to who he listens to and who he ignores? Because it seems like he gets advice from all corners, but like you said, listens to the conservatives. Does that reflect just a fundamental conservative ideological outlook on his part?
Well, I'll just quickly answer a little bit about. My view is that one thing, he's turning out to be far more intellectually narrow president than what I had previously imagined. In fact, he cares about a relatively small range of things. And some of the rhetoric during the presidential election campaign, indeed as Jakarta governor, in fact, I now suspect was scripted for him, and he himself had very little input to that. So these issues of religious tolerance, of human rights, of continuing political reform, I think he regards those as expendable. They are second or third order matters. What most matters for him is development, is economic growth, particularly dealing with the poorer people of Indonesia, and that's all very virtuous. I'm not criticising that, but I wish that he had a broader vision of what his presidency could be, and that's what he lacks. So he does have these progressive people around him, but you rarely hear him investing in those progressive views in public, and I don't really think he feels at all confident in doing so.
Indeed, I mean, it seems like if you can actually frame a reactionary political agenda in the kind of language of development and economics that appeals to him, you can get him to do some remarkable things. For instance, this recent decree that he signed that protects local officials from prosecution for corruption. Has he bought into this idea that actually the anti-corruption effort is getting in the way of so-called development?
Yes, but and this is again one of the most surprising, I think, developments over the past year, is that Jokowi, the president, who was very much supported by anti-corruption activists, reform activists, and so we all expected him, I guess, to implement and to pursue those sorts of reforms. And what was surprising is how quickly he abandoned the anti-corruption drive. And there are many reasons, I think, why he did that. But it demonstrates, I think, a fickleness in the way he approaches policy and the way he approaches people. And what's surprising is that it's under Jokowi's watch, not under a previous president, that we've seen the attack on anti-corruption, on the Corruption Eradication Commission. He enabled the criminalisation of their directors. He's enabling the Parliament to attack the law on anti-corruption in the Parliament, and he's also, as you said, Liam, he's now kind of singing the song of the old elites in terms of anti-corruption being a hindrance to efficiency and to development, and that these anti-corruption activists get in the way of the business of government. And I think that's really dangerous, in fact.
Yeah.
What do you think?
I think that also applies to economic front. I mean, we have said about contradiction, and it's, at the end of the day, it's all a matter of who has Jokowi's ears, right? So we see very contradictory signals for if he talks about agriculture, for example, and then investment, because different ministers have different views and even contradictory at times. So it's unfortunate that it all matters of who get his ears, because he himself seems to be lacking the narratives.
You mentioned that someone who has his ear, and that brings up another little detail of his presidency. He's not known for being a reader, is he?
He doesn't seem to like it.
No. Another one of these actors who has sort of cloaked their own agenda in the language of national development is the military. Now, there's been quite a bit of speculation about how serious the military's efforts to sort of sneak its way back into areas of civilian governance have been under the Jokowi presidency. Do you think that it's too early to be alarmed, or is something really significant going on here?
it looks like it could be developing a kind of momentum that would make one concerned, because we have a consistent pattern of senior military and defence officials, including the Defence Minister, coming out and making statements that, and indeed taking the initial steps to put in place programs that would greatly expand the role of the military within society. And much when the so-called reformasi process began in 1998 after Suharto was forced from office, one of the key targets of the reformers was the military. They wanted the military as much as possible back in the barracks. And what we've seen under Jokowi, to an extent that again was one of the really surprising things about his presidency, is how he either didn't care or indeed was happy to go along with the military coming back out of the barracks and being involved in village development, distributing food, building bridges and roads, engaging in ideological campaigns on campuses, taking a much bigger role in counter-terrorism, even providing staff for prisons. So there are a whole range of things that have been proposed, and some new quite extensive moves that are now underway, such as having in effect a civilian defence force that might be as many as 100 million people, and everyone under the age of 50 is obliged to be involved. There's been not that broader range of opposition to that at the moment, but we just see in the next year, when people consider the cost of this, when ordinary citizens start working out how disruptive this might be, and indeed whether it's at all necessary under current circumstances in which Indonesia really doesn't face a legitimate threat anywhere in the region, whether this is all worthwhile, or is this a self-interested military pushing these programs. I'm hoping that it's the latter, that people begin to push back against this, and that the efforts of the current TNI, the current Armed Forces head, and the current Defence Minister will end up facing serious resistance. But at the moment, you'd have to say they have wind in their sails.
Now, just one last question. I know it seems a bit silly to speculate about the 2019 election so far out, but let's do it anyway. There have been several polls that have come out in the last week or so in conjunction with the one-year anniversary of Jokowi's inauguration. They've actually started measuring the electability of candidates for the election in 4 years' time. Prabowo Subianto looks like he's still very much a contender. Where is Prabowo now? What's he doing? And what is his agenda for the next 4 years?
I would just say he might try again and he will fail again.
You're confident that Jokowi will be re-elected?
I'm not saying that, but I'm saying that Prabowo will not become the president.
Any speculation?
I wouldn't rule out him throwing the hat in the ring again. I think that we all know how ambitious he is and how badly he wanted the presidency. And even though he's been laying low for the past year, I don't see any reason, in fact, barring his health maybe, why he wouldn't run again. And I mean, I'm not sure how much we should read into those polls. It's quite natural that, you know, when people are really displeased with the current president, that they might look to what the alternative might have been and say that would be better right now. If the election was held tomorrow, that would be better. But I think that Prabowo will certainly, consider running again in 2019.
And Prabowo has played an interesting game because during the presidential election, he was so emphatic in his opposition to everything that Jokowi said and everything that Jokowi represented. And, you know, we saw his challenge to the election result itself. So I think a lot of us had the expectation that he would be a very implacable opposition leader. And in fact, he's proved to be anything but. And at times he's been quite willing to cooperate with Jokowi to allow Jokowi to achieve, at times of considerable political pressure for Jokowi, Prabowo has helped him out. And he might be doing this for a number of reasons. One is that by occasionally accepting Jokowi's phone calls and invitations, he keeps himself in the political mix, as it were. Jokowi is consulting him and he's able to increase his own influence. But also, there's a lot of reporting that some of his companies aren't doing very well, and there is also speculation that some of those companies have been helped out by the government, given contracts. And so, if that's the case, well, then there is a material interest that Prabowo has from helping JOKOWI. So I'm also fully expecting he will be a presidential candidate in 2019. But relations between the two men haven't been as arctic as I was expecting them to be.
And I know I said that was the last question, but I suppose we should just address this one remaining sort of puzzle, I guess, about the JOKOWI presidency, is how easy the opposition in Parliament has been on the administration. Are we seeing this as sort of proof of the theory that really the cost of stability in Indonesian politics is basically putting a reform agenda on ice? What do you think?
I don't know.
Why have they been so docile? And why did they go so docile so quickly?
I think you're exactly right. If the government had not been going to such effort to accommodate a large number of vested interests, well then we wouldn't see this level of cooperativeness from the Parliament. And the fact that Eve mentioned before about the Corruption Eradication Commission, and most people in Parliament have been gunning for that commission for many years, because it has cut down many of their colleagues who indeed were vastly corrupt, and they had it coming to them. But they want very much to neuter the KPK, and JOKOWI he vacillates on the issue, is my reading of it, but I think they must feel as if they may well get quite a few of the things that they want, and we're probably going to have a far less effective leadership of the KPK than we've had in the previous term. This group of commissioners have been criminalised, facing prosecution. So that's one example of the kind of thing that JOKOWI is doing, which in fact keeps parliamentarians happy.
Well, as usual, I guess it looks like there's a trade-off between reform and cordial relations between different elites. Guys, thanks very much for coming in today. Appreciate you making the time.